Hello there! I've recently published my first game on itch.io, so now I'm moving on to a bigger and more ambitious project. It's going to be an open world game, so I decided to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about open world landscape setup in Unreal Engine. Basically, the goal of today's video is to go from this to this. Let's get right into it. First thing we need to do is to actually create the landscape. All I have in the level at the moment is a light source, a post-processing volume and the Good Sky plugin from Unreal's marketplace. Creating a landscape in Unreal is as simple as choosing the landscape mode, and the creation mode is conveniently opened up for us. There's a lot of options for size settings, as each section is split into a million smaller sections to optimize asset loading, world partition and all that other backend stuff no one really understands. There are two things that you actually need to know on this step. One is that the overall resolution means your overall landscape size in meters. And two is that the height map is always set from negative 256 units to positive 256 units. So, if your z-axis scale was 1, then the highest object you could possibly have in the world would be 512 centimeters high, with the default scale of 100 that changes to 512 meters, and for all other heights you just need to multiply it by the right amount. I want to create some high mountains in my game, so I went with a nice and even 1000. And here we go. Our landscape looks pretty ugly, but at least it exists. Now, let's sculpt some basic shapes. I added a hill, a mountain, a riverbed, and a ridge that connects the hill to the mountain. I chose these specific land formations to test the features that I will add later on in the video. Now, let's make it a bit less ugly. First, we can create a simple landscape material and switch it to use material attributes and layer blending node, which will allow us to easily paint different material layers on the landscape. After importing a few textures I made before, I created 4 layers and plugged in our material into the landscape. At first the landscape was completely black, since we need to create layer data for each layer first. And now that it's done, our landscape has actual textures on it. Sure, I'll need to fix that tiling problem, but once I put down foliage and other meshes you won't even see the issue. We can now start painting the textures based on layer data, so I painted our riverbed with gravel. Of course, layer painting such a massive map would take years, so let me show you one of many ways to automatically apply some textures. All we need are these two nodes. This will feed the data regarding the slope of our map to our material, so it should be able to paint the sides of our mountain and the ridge, while sparing the little hill. After plugging in the correct values and tweaking the parameters a bit, I was able to get it to work. It's a very simple feature, but it will let me shave off hours of layer painting for my mountainous biomes. The next feature we're going to add is blending together the landscape and the static mesh. You see, in the default state, when you place a mesh on the landscape, you can very clearly see the border between them. It doesn't look good, so let's fix it. All it takes is a magical resource called Virtual Texture. It essentially allows us to transfer data from one material into another, so we use it to transfer both distance and color data from landscape to the mesh. And that allows us to create a nice little transition, like so. Now, the last feature I'll add are surface-dependent footstep sounds, so that each layer has its own footstep sound. It's surprisingly simple to do. First, we need to add a few surface types in project settings, and then create physical materials for them and assign these materials to each landscape layer. Now we can add an anim notify to our running animation, which will do a collision trace from our character's foot to the surface below it. Then we can simply do a switch on the surface and play specific sounds for each surface. Here's the system working in practice with some shitty stock sound effects that I will switch out later in the project. At first I wanted to leave it there, but I decided to add a few things from the asset store, just to test if the landscape looks good with foliage. I still dislike asset stores, so don't expect to see these trees in the future videos. But here's what it looks like now. I think it's quite a leap from an empty level, and I'm quite satisfied with the result. The best thing about it is that thanks to Unreal's many features, doing all of that took me less time than editing this video. Anyway, I'm leaving links to a few resources regarding landscape, so feel free to check them out if you're a dev who's also interested in making an open world game. There's also another feature that was very useful in previous versions of Unreal Engine, which was automatically populating a landscape layer with a mesh. For example, I could make it so that the ground areas are automatically covered with the grass mesh, but I decided against adding it, since Unreal 5.2 not only supports foliage, but it also has a new features of volumes capable of random mesh generation. The new feature is insanely powerful and allows to create complex rules for mesh generation, so I figured I'd rather use that feature than the landscape material. And that's all for today. See ya!